question. Stuart, can I just ask you, I'm going to get you to talk about what made you come to Glasgow and study what you did and give us a kind of career synopsis. But before I get to that, could you tell us what I actually meant when I said improving healthcare, wearable medical devices, etc.? What's your business all about?
So, well, firstly, quickly to say thank you to you, Stephen and Simone, for having me here. It's a real honour and a privilege to have the chance to come and speak again at Glasgow. Definitely miss my time at Glasgow. 9 years were great 9 years, and I do miss it dearly. So not that I'm far from Glasgow now, I still get a chance to come and visit every now and again, and still lots of friends there. So in terms of kind of what the business is, that's quite a low-level tech description. Really, the whole idea came about from personal experiences of what healthcare has become and what healthcare is necessarily required to be right now, and that is that patients, when they get sick, something happens at home, they realize they need to get into an ambulance or drive very quickly to the nearest hospital, where they will spend a long amount of time until they're deemed fit enough to go home. And away they go home until they get sick again, which often in many cases, for many patients that are generally quite unwell, could be days later. 25% of patients will get sick at home shortly after and go back into hospital. And they're just going back and forth. And so the reality is, this isn't great for patients. This isn't great for healthcare professionals seeing the same patients all the time, and it's certainly not great for the cost of healthcare. Healthcare does cost a lot of money, and it's not good for anyone that this outcome is just not great. So we realized, why aren't patients able to be managed from their own homes? How can we transition that healthcare delivery, looking after a patient in a hospital? How can we bring that and deliver that in a patient's home? Patients want to stay at home. They've got everything they need and want at home, except people keeping an eye on them and looking for any signs of deterioration. So what we realize is the technology exists, whether a wearable device to keep an eye on a patient, a software system that can be constantly looking for all this information that we can collect about a patient, spot a patient who may be becoming ill, at worst already ill, and ensure the right people know about that and come and see that patient in their own home. That's the model of healthcare. If you look back to Victorian Britain, wealthy people got cared for at home because people came to them. And so that 5 years ago, when we started this journey, well, 6.5 years ago, really on the back end of the PhD, but 5 years when we started really going to market with this, was a nice idea. Fast forward to 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and all of a sudden it became really the next era of healthcare. And that's really what we're now a part of delivering.
Well, that's really interesting. And I must admit, it's, as somebody who's getting chronologically more and more challenged, it's interesting though. I mean, it's true. It's much more comforting if you're in a space that you're familiar with. So for your mental health, I'm sure it would really help patients as well as their health. Absolutely. And obviously with COVID and bugs in hospitals and all of that, staying at home is probably better for you physical health as well. Sorry, I'm not meant to be doing all this kind of speaking.
Sounds like you're the converted.
I think so.
It's good.
So Stuart, tell us a wee bit about your time at Glasgow. What led you to choose the degree that you did? Because it's a slightly unusual, slightly unusual combination. And then your PhD. Can you talk us through that if you don't mind?
Yeah.
You're at school, and then what made you make these choices, and how did it go?
It was a bit of an unexpected journey. So, as you can tell by my accent, I didn't grow up in Scotland. I actually grew up down in near Cambridge, down in England. Actually, I've got family, past family from Scotland, so certainly had a kind of connection there, but never really spent any time in Scotland. So Glasgow was a bit of a random choice for me when I was doing my UCAS admissions off the back of A-levels. I like the idea of being in the mountains. There aren't really many mountains in that part of East Anglia. It's quite a flat part of the world. So that was pretty much the selling point to me, was the opportunity to get to the outdoors. And so really there's no better place to be than Scotland, albeit it was a long way from home. I obviously just had to stomach some of the long train and flights, train journeys and flights back and forth. So came to Scotland, did the admissions, the viewing day, and thought, this is actually quite a nice place. So got the results and then decided Glasgow was the place to be. And come the first day of term, got in a van, drove all my stuff up to Glasgow. I'd never really spent any time in Glasgow beyond just passing through for the day. And that was the start of a journey. The reason for computing was, well, it had always been something that interested me and was always kind of into tech. But I'd actually spent a gap year prior to coming to uni working in in really small business. And so from that, I'd realized actually there's a huge amount of value in tech. But when you can figure out the business side around that, then actually there's even more opportunities on, how do you turn this into not just a piece of code, a piece of software, but how do you build businesses around this? So that always kind of interested me. And I suppose some of that set the scene for why startups always made me curious, because I could see huge value in using tech to drive and test out new ideas and figuring out then from a business side, how do you finance that and scale that up and grow the market? And that's where that came from.
Yeah.
So 4 years of undergrad, business computing science, was coming towards the end of that. It was 2009, 2008. Obviously, the world was not looking too great. Middle of the financial crash. The good news was that there were great jobs in tech still available. The bad news was that really not very well paid, not great kind of opportunities as far as lots of banks looking for people to come and join. Not really much in the way of tech companies doing much in the UK at that time. So I was kind of left with the choice of do I go and join a tech company? I actually had an offer on the table from a big tech company down in London. And move to London, or do I see what's next? And so I ended up doing the PhD option, which was kind of amusing because I'd never ever thought that was going to happen. I never even planned on doing that. It was a bit of a curveball at the last minute, and it was really because my supervisor had been supervising my undergrad dissertation, and kind of suggested, hey, why don't you check this out? And there's a few opportunities here that may lead into some interesting career opportunities. I never really thought I'd be an academic, but I thought it was quite an interesting thing to do. And I was definitely kind of interested in learning more. So yeah, sure enough, that was the start of a PhD in computing science.
That's interesting. So I don't know, if you think about from then on, I mean, how you've obviously been in tech, you've had these jobs in tech, and in terms of career planning, how would you sum that up, if I could ask you that? So how much, if you think back to then, how much was it career planned and how much was it not planned? How could you answer a question like that?
So I guess as a kind of personality trait is I don't tend to plan too much, and I tend to try and wait until opportunities happen. What I do try and do is kind of open as many doors as possible. So I was doing interviews for various grad programs, was getting kind of offers lined up there and figuring out my options, and was doing that kind of midway through my fourth year at uni. So I kind of knew what was out there. I knew a lot of people, particularly in computing science, were looking towards banking. I think about 40 or 50% of the people back in my day were going towards the banking industry, albeit that changed because obviously the financial crash, but there were still big numbers going out. So I hadn't really, other than trying to apply to as much as possible, which I think is the number one thing you can do, because it's easier to turn things down, but once they've been offered to you, than it is to try and find things if you've got nothing. The first time I really actually genuinely thought about career planning was that on having the offer for big tech, what would have been an amazing job, and sometimes a PhD that seemed like a real curveball, I actually sat down and wrote bullet points, pros and cons of what I should and shouldn't do. And I actually spoke to people that worked in tech, friends and family, and asked them, what do you think about this? And likewise spoke to people I knew in the university on the other side of that, and actually kind of went through that to try and rationalize that decision. It was tight, but the PhD won.
No, that's really interesting. And in fact, if a student came to me and asked for advice and help, I would actually tell them to do what you've just done, to talk to people, or what you did. Sorry, it was a while ago now. What you did, because I think that's really important. I've got a question from Islam, who's saying, I'm doing an MSc in global health and I'm so interested in health tech. So can I know what are the specific skills the market's demanding nowadays? That's a tough question.
That's a good question. That's a good one.
So one of the good things right now is that if you'd have asked me 5 or 6 years ago, health tech was really not doing very well. The industry was not, investors were not really investing heavily in health tech startups, specifically in the UK, because the investment scene just wasn't there for it. Fast forward, obviously 5 years, 6 years, and all of a sudden there is now cash splashing around everywhere in health tech. So there are no shortage of early stage companies that are all desperate to do great stuff. So right now is really boomtown in startups, especially health tech. So now is a great time to be talking to people. It depends very much on really the kind of stage of startup you're interested in joining. So obviously you've got the Babylon Healths
of the world. Obviously, really probably the UK's biggest kind of startup, albeit it's a bit beyond startup now, health tech, and they're going to be looking for probably quite specialist skill sets. So people that can bring in, either specific tech stacks or areas of regulatory expertise or clinical expertise.
Yeah.
And for instance, Babylon, I know, are actually operating in Rwanda, I think is one of the big areas right now. So there are international opportunities. I think they're also looking in the US as well. So understanding those international health systems and some of the challenges there are probably quite interesting for them. And some of the business development side of that would certainly be a big part of that. So that's a bigger startup. If you're looking to work in a smaller startup, one of the big tips I can give you is try and build your generalizable skill set. Rarely in a startup, we're at 140 people now, and even now at the scale we're at, it's often that we ask our people to do things that they're really just not, that's not their normal thing to do, and they embrace that and run with it. And having people that have that flexibility, adaptability, and can learn rapidly is just incredible. You can really help people build their careers in ways they didn't foresee. And for us, just having someone that can if there's a fire burning here, they can jump on that and learn on the fly, speak to the people that they need to kind of get the expertise and bring that all together. Those people, that versatility is just incredible. Like, they're really, that's what I really look for when I'm hiring people.
Right. That's really interesting. That's really interesting, Stuart. And actually, I don't know if but you probably will be aware of this, but you're just repeating what people are saying who are commenting on Industry 4.0, the fourth industrial revolution with AI and all that. And that what they're looking for are people who are cognitive flexibility, they call it, they're able to really apply things and learn, really naturally curious. They just want to learn because it's something they can learn. So you're right, it's more of an attitude and a kind of mindset than it is just being able to code or whatever. So that's great. And it said somebody else have got another question. This is great. We'll get back to your career in a minute, but thanks for the questions. Juan is saying, how has the COVID pandemic affected your company and the services that it provides? So it's a good question.
That is a very, very good question. So we've tripled in size as a company since the start of COVID. Wow. So a huge amount of investment. We did a $43 million Series B a few months ago. So things have exploded, obviously, as far as just numbers are concerned. The way I kind of phrase it to people is that we spent the first 5 years trying to push a boulder up a hill. Obviously, within a few weeks of the pandemic starting and recognizing that healthcare was going to change completely, well, at that point, unforeseeably, but realizing that we were in the middle of something huge, we're now really chasing that boulder down a hill. There's obviously a lot more competition joining the market that we're obviously trying to keep up with and make sure we focus down on what we're really good at. But everything's just moved quickly. In terms of building the right platform of technology, we're kind of we've built the core. How do we now figure out how to deliver this at scale? We operate in 6 continents now already. We're monitoring patients across 6 continents, so things have kind of scaled up quite crazily. We obviously do a lot of clinical trial and also kind of day-to-day care delivery as well. So we've been working on a whole bunch of COVID therapeutics and clinical trials for those, keeping patients safe and collecting endpoint data. So all of that kind of came out of left field. So really the whole world changed in a way that we could never anticipated. About 2 days before lockdown, I was out in West Africa, stood in an airport, having to get a SIM sorted so I can jump on a conference call while stood in a queue that was, because all the flights being cancelled going back from Africa back to Europe. Stood for about 3 hours, listening to absolute chaos happening and basically tooling up every manufacturing facility we had available to try and start getting kit out as soon as damn possible. So it was a pivotal moment for the business, and against obviously a pretty awful backdrop, I hope we've had a positive impact on changing the course of things.
That's really interesting, and just shows you how important the work is that you're doing. I think COVID, it's just accelerating the rate of change to the way we were going anyway. But that's what people are saying. But maybe in your case, it's even more taking you in a direction that you couldn't have foreseen. I'm going to come back to students' questions in a minute. There's thanks for Stuart Jeffrey who's asked one. But before I do that, would it be possible for you, Stuart, to give us a kind of brief history of your career thus far after your PhD? What have been your career highs, if there are any of those? Maybe tell me some of them.
startups tend to yield some high highs and some low lows, but we'll start on the back end of PhD. So during PhD, really, obviously, I kind of got stuck into the academic side of things, spent a lot of time going to conferences around the world, was really quite lucky that the computer science school supported that and was really kind of very strongly of the mind that if you publish papers and produce output, then they will support you to do that. That's great because it meant I was able to go and start meeting different people, both academics and in industry. One good thing is in computing science conferences tends to be a fairly solid mix, 50-50 of those two crowds. So you can really build great kind of collaborations and also open up the doors for future employment. So that's the number one thing I'd recommend during PhDs, especially, is just to take all those opportunities and go and network with people, go sit down, go for a drink with people, go sit down and talk through what they're doing and find common ground. From that, I made a few friends at Microsoft. Microsoft is really obviously a huge company, but has one of the best kind of academic faculties in the world, Microsoft Research, and still one of the best labs in the world, kind of up there with Google Research, obviously Facebook Labs, all these guys. A lot of them all know each other quite well and really sit on the industrial side of a lot of the academic research going on. So I was quite lucky then to be invited to go and join Microsoft Research on a summer internship in 2012. So I spent 3 months out in Microsoft Silicon Valley doing that, which was absolutely fantastic. That kind of opened my eyes to not just kind of really academia and research at a totally different scale, given the insane amount of data and resources these folks have to do that. Allowed me to publish some papers, work on patents, to see a whole different perspective on research kind of beyond the academic lab. And that really kind of then, I suppose, expanded that network of people that I knew in industry. I was then back again in 2014 towards the end of my PhD. I was actually working on stuff that was not my PhD, my thesis at all, which was actually kind of helpful because of intellectual property issues, but actually gave me a chance to do something completely unique. And so, it really gave me a lot of opportunities. I could have gone straight back. I think in the week I left, I had 5 job offers on the table in Silicon Valley. So, obviously tech industry right now is a bit mad. Pretty much every big tech right now, if you've got a PhD in something of interest, any kind of AI, ML related, there's a good chance you're going to have some people wanting to speak to you out in Silicon Valley or Seattle right now. So that was a very real opportunity for me, and I was at pains to try and to decide whether or not to pursue that or go the startup route. I came back, was finishing up my PhD thesis, was writing that up, going through the pain and misery that I think if there's any PhD students here will know all too well, anyone that's writing up. Generally not the funnest, most exciting time of the PhD, but obviously has to be done. Just as I was coming towards the end of that, trying to make decisions, I actually caught up with I was keen on looking at startups, really just because why not? I was always interested in building businesses, and it felt like something that was quite different to going and working in big tech and a corporate environment. And so I spoke to a few friends of mine that were in the startup community in Glasgow, Edinburgh, and got an intro to another guy who was building a company in healthcare, or at that point was trying to pitch those ideas. And so, at that point we were basically in working out of bedrooms, trying to live as cheaply as damn possible, literally living off of noodles. And I'd run out of PhD funding at that point, was doing as much work as I could on software contracting, just totally separate stuff to try and make some cash, and pretty much subsisting as best I could. And so we decided, hey, why not? Let's go for it. Let's see what happens. And so sure enough, from a bedroom, we started building out the kind of early seeds of what is today Current Health.
Wow. That's really interesting. And I suppose it goes to show you don't need much investment in terms of hardware and machines. It's just, it's amazing you can do that. Yeah. That's amazing. Now, you must have had, one of the things we like in the Big Brave, and I have my Big Brave mug here, is that you must have had some setbacks along the way. So how did you deal with them?
Oh, yeah. I think there were probably several times where I thought I wasn't going to be finishing a PhD. Right. I don't think there's many PhDs that go through a full program without a few wobbles along the way. I think that's just a natural part of the journey. I certainly found it very hard to come back from the very sunny, well-paid climate of Silicon Valley back to UK in the middle of winter. That wasn't the funnest journey. And so coming back to finish a PhD did feel quite painful and felt like, well, what's the purpose of this? But then I also realized that if you spent 4 years going through this process, doing the research, you might as well write it up and get the benefit. And that really is what it's all about. That's the painful bit, but actually, the valuable bit, once you graduate, it makes you realize what it was all worthwhile for. During going back to back when I chose to do a PhD in the first place, that was quite an agonizing decision, because no one in my family had ever gone down the route of a PhD before. This was a totally new thing, and a lot of people didn't really understand why I'd want to do that. And so, my family were obviously supportive, but it still felt a bit of an odd decision to take. To spend 9 years at university felt counterintuitive. So I was kind of chomping at the bit to get out into the world at the same time. So it felt like I was kind of delaying that. And so, there was a lot of kind of junctions that I came to and had to figure out, rightly or wrongly, what was the right way here, and have some conviction. When it came to startups, startups really are roller coasters, high highs and low lows. Not getting funding, losing customers, everything going horribly wrong. It just goes wrong. We'd be here for a long time if I told you about all the things that went wrong, because it far outweighs all the things that go right. But at the end of the day, to quote one of my colleagues, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So, for the small number of things that actually do work out well, the people you try and work with that do want to work with you, and the opportunities, the customers, the partners you get a chance to meet, things happen in spontaneous ways. I cannot emphasize how much just having a conversation, having coffee with someone, buy someone a coffee, and 20 minutes, nothing will come out of it, there and then, and it's all great. But then 2 years down the line, your paths might cross in a really odd way. And that's how I got an internship in Microsoft Research, is someone that as weird as this, it was a guy who came to Glasgow to a conference that was being organised, and I said to him, "Hey, let's go grab a beer," and randomly ended up in one of the I think it was the O2 Arena, like a rock night, totally randomly. And he was like, "Oh, this is pretty cool. Oh, by the way, I don't suppose you want to come out to Silicon Valley? We've got some more stuff like this out there." As random as that, that's where that came from, right? It wasn't a cold email. It was because I just met him at a conference and bought him a beer.
No, that's really, really interesting, Stuart. There's a model of career planning students, and you can find out about this on our website. It's called planned happenstance. It's it's a bit of a cheesy term, but it talks about that very what you're talking about. It's like, as long as you're active and you're doing stuff and you're meeting people, getting yourself out there, you don't know what's going to come out of something. It sounds as almost miraculous.
Absolutely.
You talk to somebody, and then a few months later they come back and something happens. So you're absolutely right, and it's a really interesting thing. But what you have got to do is remain active, and remain resilient. And I suppose I'm really getting at, what do you think's the secret of your resilience, being able to come back from those knockbacks, etc.? What do you think?
It really is. Just getting up in the morning and realizing, no matter what happened the day before, just get on with today and leave what happened yesterday, and something else will happen. Spontaneous things happen just day to day. Just don't overthink it. Don't dwell on it. Just do the next stuff and see what happens. Startup world is a bit chaotic at the best of times. It really is just take every opportunity, take every chance to speak to as many people as possible. Someone will make an introduction for you that you may find just out of nowhere becomes a huge opportunity.
That's really interesting. We've got a couple of questions now.
Yeah.
I mentioned Stewart Jeffries. When you come up with these products that allowed patients to be observed remotely, how were you able to identify the areas that needed your products most? That's an interesting question.
That is a good question. So that's actually quite a big question, and actually one that kind of transcends a few different areas. I'll tell you a bit about how we did things, and I suppose really the better way of doing things. So the way we did things was to start building a device for the sake of building a device, and kind of thought, well, what things can we build onto this device, which is a nice way of saying it's kind of tech-led, because we were a bunch of engineers looking to build something interesting. That's great because it helps you build technology. What it doesn't help you build is a product that actually has value to someone. But the good news is it meant that we were kind of ahead of the curve of building the device. And so, over the last 4 or 5 years, there have been inflections in what people want from our device and what people expect from this market. And that's been kind of interesting because it takes a lot of time to build a good medical device, and that's hard. It's quite hard for me to walk into a hospital or a clinic and say, hey, what does everyone want? What's your problem? And that's very much the corporate kind of, let's go figure out the problem statement and figure out what that looks like. The reality is healthcare is really complicated. And whether it's US healthcare, UK healthcare, global healthcare, it actually is really fundamentally different because conditions are different. The way the workflow healthcare is provided is different. The incentives as far as financially who's paying for it and how they paying for it totally differs. So your product has to figure out, how it has to essentially map into all these different stakeholders and expectations of healthcare. And that makes it really hard. It is actually kind of hard to say this is what we're going to do. And we weren't a big enough company to be able to go in with that, certainty. And even if we were, I think we would have probably been wrong. And then not to mention, obviously, the moment COVID came along, all of that went out the window anyway.
Yeah.
So it was a world that didn't exist like a few months later. And all of a sudden, there's a whole bunch of new opportunities. Yeah. Things like oncology, cancer care, patients were typically going to hospitals to go and get infusions. Now everyone wants to figure out how to do that in the home because patients don't want to go in the hospital and get COVID, let alone hospital-acquired infections. And that's a very expensive place for them to hang out for 2 weeks, needlessly, when they spend so much time there already. The reality is that was a 5 or 10 year long kind of project to try and do that. And everyone's now trying to accelerate that for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So actually, from our perspective, the better way is to build the platform, the foundation, and then bring in the right people that understand healthcare and figure out how to build bring that configurable product and map it into how it's going to be used. And so that's how we've done it. So we typically are led by people approach us and say, hey, we've got this patient population. COVID-19, obviously, oncology, these certain types of patients, CAR-T, respiratory patients, pulmonary patients. Here's our patient population. They're typically elderly. They don't have good internet at home. They don't have good access to local clinic because they're quite remote. They could live in the middle of nowhere. And then we look to say, well, okay, here's what our technology stack can do, and here's how we can figure out how to make this work for this patient population. And don't get me wrong, that tends to go wrong, along the way as we learn what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
And this is inevitable, right? In fact, I'll give you a good example, totally random, just tangential. Yeah. We were working with a customer in Florida, and we found that our wireless connectivity was really problematic, really patchy in Florida, and we didn't know why. We turned up on site to go and try and figure out, we were invited, thankfully, into the patient to try and understand what was going on. And the answer is because in Florida, it's all single-story buildings. So whereas in the UK, we have a double-story, two-story house, quite compact, all fine, Wi-Fi signal goes through the house, all good. In Florida, massive house, single story because of hurricanes. Guess what? The middle of the house is one lump of concrete. There's a big concrete casing, essentially, that's all about keeping the house strong and safe. In the middle of a hurricane, you would go into the middle of the house, and then the wooden bits would obviously potentially get damaged, but you're in your kind of concrete enclave inside. Yeah, it's really terrible for wireless signal. We had to engineer a solution for that, which is what we did. So our product solution had to change for that patient population because of their geography.
That's really interesting.
We had to figure out that. To serve that.
Yeah. So and then once you've done that, it can be applied in many different areas, can't you? Once you've worked out how to get the signal through concrete. Yeah. It's interesting because the next question, it kind of follows on from that, and you might have answered it already. And if you have, don't worry. But can you elaborate more on the business model and the operations in your company, and is it affordable for all users?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So we have we really have two kind of core customer groups. One is big pharma companies, so companies that are developing new drugs or taking an existing drug and figuring out how to optimize or deliver that drug in a new way or make it better in some way. And so, we support clinical trials with monitoring patients at home. So, for instance, we did some work with some COVID therapeutics, whereby patients that obviously 50% of the patients that had the therapeutic, 50% hadn't. We were blinded to which one had the therapeutic and which one had. And so every patient that reported symptoms received one of our monitoring kits to be monitored at home to ensure that if that patient got sick, we don't want adverse events in a trial because it obviously is a big problem. We don't want patients getting sick, really sick at home. We certainly don't want patients dying. So knowing about that sooner and intervening is clearly really advantageous. And so simultaneously, we can collect information, data about how that patient's body's responding to COVID and that's helping them to understand the therapeutic or COVID itself. And so, that's really a lot of what we do in that space. Simultaneously, on the care delivery side, so think about your day-to-day standard care patients in hospitals being discharged and going back, and how do we support those? We essentially provide a monthly subscription whereby we provide the hardware and the service that does the monitoring piece, and provide that for a monthly price to a healthcare provider. So they have, say, 30 virtual beds, which is 30 kits that can get shared around the patients coming and going off of their service. So it's kind of like a virtual ward, virtual care, virtual ward service. Those patients are typically more unwell these days because obviously hospitals are pretty full right now, and patients that would typically stay in hospital are now being sent home with this layer of technology to try and make sure that they're kept safe, and any intervention required happens as soon as possible. So we kind of step up and down the acuity. Some are really quite sick, some are more kind of longer term chronic patients, and we match our product to what's going on there. A lot of our problems are actually not tech problems. So the device, the wearable, you'd think is the big challenging thing. And don't get me wrong, that keeps me awake a lot. What's actually really hard is patient populations are not the kind of people that like to fiddle around with Wi-Fi connections, fiddle around with Bluetooth, do troubleshooting. They're generally quite elderly. In the majority of populations, they're generally quite unwell, very tech unaware. And so how do you make something work really quickly and easily without them messing around? You have a very small window to make it work for someone until they lose confidence. And that's the hard thing for us. And that's a human factors problem as much as it is a workflow problem. Getting that kit to them and making them use it is challenging. And that's the kind of thing where we spend a lot of time on the human element of what we do. It's not all just tech. Healthcare professionals are busy people as well. Mess them around and they get pretty upset pretty quickly. So in terms of affordability, we're, as a company, we've done everything we can to try and bring the price down, and we'll continue doing so. We have been quite passionate about supporting global healthcare. We support various clinical trials in third world countries. We have one running, has been running now for a while, about 1,000 patients over in Uganda, in post C-section mums, some of the highest maternal mortality. So post C-section, some of the highest death rates in the world, like 40 times more than what we see in the West. And the reason for that is because there's one doctor and a hospital of several hundred people, which means monitoring just isn't done. And so we see it as a responsibility for us to try and figure out how we bring this type of technology to those environments and really have an impact. And the first instance is obviously doing the clinical trial to prove the value of this. The second part of that is how do we then make sure these guys have the equipment that can help them. A bedside monitor costs £30,000. One of our monitors could be hundreds of pounds, which is a fraction of what it would typically cost someone, and the maintenance of that in a Western hospital.
That's really interesting. And there's a good couple of questions coming in, but I had one I wanted to ask, and you've kind of answered it. I still want to ask it. It's written all over your face what kind of inspires you, Stuart, and talking about the benefit of that. But just tell us that what does inspire you, or is it as a person inspired you, or is it what you're doing now? Is that's what's inspiring you? What is it that's giving you the inspiration you need to keep going?
So, I mean, there's probably not many jobs where you can get out of bed in the morning and think, hey, something we did saved someone's life or made someone's life considerably better. You're saving a life is obvious, that's great, but just making people's lives better, giving people the opportunity to receive care at home. I think there's not many people, in this world that haven't experienced what it's like to have a loved one get ill and then, watch the consequences of that and feel completely helpless. And, sometimes we can't stop that or turn that around. What we can do is make life better and give people opportunities and options to do things on their own terms. That's huge to me. That's really kind of what drives me. At the same time, working with a lot of motivated, passionate, smart people to do this kind of stuff is pretty fun as well.
Well, it's interesting. No, it's really interesting. It's fantastic to apply your skills and attributes in that way. It's amazing, brilliant. Somebody said here, do you hope for an incorporation with your business in the NHS?
So we actually work with the NHS extensively already. We have, I think, 12 NHS customers across the UK right now. So we've actually got quite a big NHS footprint in Scotland and in England. Actually not sure about Wales. So right across the UK, we have been working with NHS. You'll see actually on our website, you'll find many case studies about some of our populations. Imperial, I think, is one of the case studies you'll spot there. NHS is a big organisation to work with. Everyone does things differently. They've obviously a huge number of patients. It's a very different organisation to what you experience in the US, at least anyway. Very different incentives, motivations, much slower moving. But the scale there is absolutely huge. They tend to focus on small pilots before scaling things up, and even then it's very fragmented. But I mean, we're a British company, so working with the NHS is a core part of who we are and where we come from and what we plan on doing long term.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And Katie's asked, she's interested as someone who's interested in and has plans to go into medical field. Is the impact of wearable tech? She's interested in the impact that wearable tech can have on your quality of life over quantity of life. And have you had much info on this metric? That sounds quite an interesting question.
This is one of the big challenges of in the NHS is measuring quality of life is quite a challenging metric to measure and quantify. It takes many years to do the studies to do this robustly. What this all boils down to fundamentally is as a small company, how do you build a body of evidence that what you're doing is good for patients, good for healthcare providers, good for financial outcomes, good for all these different kind of areas. And so for us, we spend a lot of our time working with partners to figure out how we do this. What we typically try and do is as we bring a new customer on, is we'll work out a plan that how do we collect some data that allows us to quantify the value of the product and what does it mean to patients. We do all kinds of surveys with patients and get anecdotal feedback and look to build kind of a stronger case for what we're doing. At the end of the day, we will succeed or fail based on what patients perceive of our product. And so it's really on our shoulders to make sure we figure out how to build that evidence and strengthen that over time. And to reach scale in the NHS is going to require that. That's something that happens as you start to optimize the product and how it's used longer term. And that's the journey we're now very much on. In terms of early evidence, things look great. Now it's about trying to understand how different kind of patient populations, different conditions, different environments, different types of NHS trust versus US, etc., how we can start to build that narrative.
Yeah, interesting. And somebody's asked again, have you found it hard to deal with the big pharma companies and their needs for their clinical trial research? Could you give us an example of a big pharma companies?
So I wouldn't say, I mean, there's two things that come up there. One is when you're dealing with big companies are big companies, that makes them quite challenging for small companies to work with because there's just a lot of people doing a lot of things. And, time frames tend to be very different to what you see in a startup. The startup every day matters. Startups tend to be losing money. And so every day you're losing money. So every day that goes by is another day of lost money. And so, yeah, that's a challenge, for good reason. Big pharma are very risk-averse organizations. Everything they do is heavily regulated. They're always looking to figure out how they can reduce risk and do things better and do the right thing. And that means that there's always a huge burden of documentation and discussion about how do we understand this risk and mitigate that. And that's something that we deal with as a company. We've had to build an organization that works with that. That is a bit of a culture shock when you're not used to it.
I bet.
But for the right reasons, a very high risk business to work in pharma.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting question. Now this is, I think somebody's obviously wanting you to engage in some industrial espionage because they've said, I want to create products for healthcare professionals that improve healthcare quality, efficiency. Do you have any advice for how I could identify areas that need innovation?
I mean, so that's a huge question. The first thing is to go and speak to some healthcare professionals, really understand how they do their job and what works and what doesn't work for them. You will almost certainly find a few themes. One is overwork right now is a big problem. Documentation burden, so all the administrative stuff that's taking their time away from patients. And IT, if you're talking to anyone in the NHS, especially, IT will be one of the biggest things you're probably going to hear about frustrations with, just nothing works. And we're not talking the fancy AI, all this kind of stuff. What we're talking about is just accessing a computer that actually turns on and works, and you can see a patient's record within less than 15 minutes. This is like the kind of bread and butter that actually the ball is being dropped in many places in healthcare. So, that they're all kind of grand challenges, really, that one thing is not going to solve. a lot of this is, and a lot of healthcare in essence, because it really is a very complex system. Healthcare is delivered as it's a systemic problem. It's not just you solve one thing. Like it just shuffles the problems to other places. You have to start kind of thinking about how do you be incremental and iterate on what a solution might look like. And so, yes, you can ask people. Yes, you can try and do something, but really trying to get something in front of someone, a demo is a great way to then start to get that buy-in and then start to figure out, like, engage those conversations for what next. If you're going to go down the clinical product route, then you need to be speaking to someone who knows something about regulatory, because anything in healthcare, for obvious reasons, it's a heavily regulated business. There may be ways to figure out ways around that. So, if you're not diagnosing patients, it may not be a medical device. It may be a piece of software that's a wellness app. So there are smart ways to start thinking about how can we do something that's amenable to a startup or a single person growing that.
No, that's really, really interesting as well. And again, it's all about being active, isn't it? And rather than sitting back, you've got to go and make things happen and talk to the right people to make sure you're not making any mistakes. Simone's just let us know we've only got 5 minutes left, Stuart. So I just wondered, here's a tough question. Well, I think it's a tough question for you. How do you define and rate success in your life? Is it through life happiness, professional success, something else? What is it that makes you feel successful?
I think just doing something I enjoy most of the time. I think it's fair to say in any job you're going to do, you're not going to enjoy it all the time. That's a given. I think that's just probably inevitable. Not everything can be great all the time, but if I can step back at the end of the day and say, right, I'm kind of proud of what I did today, or certainly kind of average that out over on a week to week, maybe proud of what I did this week, and step back and kind of drink a coffee at the weekend on Saturday morning, think actually, there is a benefit and impact for this. That to me is a benchmark of professional success. It's not about money. It's not about, credentials, all this kind of stuff. And to me, it's about, do people look at the impact of the work we've done here and think, hey, that's going to have some benefit to the world. And that to me is what motivates me.
And that's really interesting. Thanks a lot. That's really interesting and brilliant. So we've talked a lot about you and how you've got to where you've got to. And I mentioned earlier, Industry 4.0 and a bit of futurology, but what do you think of the future? How do you kind of see it going from here? What's in the pipeline for you?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So, to use healthcare as an example, everyone talks about automation and AI is going to magically automate everything. I, for one, am scared of a world where AI is automated or pretends to automate doctors. I don't want to live in that world. Having got a PhD in AI, really kind of elements of AI and experience in that. AI is a means to an end to automate the boring basic stuff. What I really want to be doing is making sure humans are freed up to do what humans do best, and that's kind of creative, emotional tasks and empathetic kind of interaction with people. An algorithm will never be able to provide that, no matter which way you look at it. An algorithm is best off, assisting people to do that. And I think automation is going to, automation, it seems like a great idea, and I think it is going to have huge impact. But let's not forget that humans interact with humans, and that is important. Certainly in areas like healthcare, maybe different in other areas and other spaces, and in which case, obviously, fairness, transparency of some of that automation is clearly a huge thing. But in healthcare, that to me is really where I want to see the future going. Is how do we free up people to provide good healthcare? The fact that a clinician right now is spending 80% of their day, looking at a computer screen and typing notes up, to me seems mad.
Yeah.
Like, why would we pay a clinician to do that? I'd rather they spend 80% of their day talking to people, reassuring them, providing good healthcare, one-to-one, and 20% of the time just making sure the documentation was up to date because it was all done automatically.
Yeah. No, yeah, I get that. I get that. And honestly, I'm towards the end of my career now, but I think as careers practitioners as well, that interaction we have with students who are, struggling or not confident or whatever, that will future-proof our job. But as you say, the AI is great for just getting information into people quickly, that kind of role. But the actual professional skill set is something that hopefully will not be able to be,
absolutely absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I think we'll just wrap up there, but I've got one final question for you, and I don't know if you can maybe do this briefly because I think we've only got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah.
I want you to imagine Stuart, that you've got a time machine and
Yep.
you're sitting in front of yourself, I don't know, in the final year of your undergrad degree. What advice would you give yourself?
Good question. Ooh, that's a deep question.
I know it is.
Yeah, that's a deep question. I actually think that the one bit of advice I'd give myself is don't try and micro optimize the small things. Like, spend those extra hours doing what seems like a pointless task. Putting together a presentation to practice speaking on something, and even though it looks like it's awful, just do it anyway, and don't sweat the small stuff if you think it all went terribly, because it's a lot better to have that practice and it all to go wrong in a small class of people where you learn from it, than say, well, where we are right now, go and do a pitch to an investor that's make or break for the business, and that's the time you don't want to get it wrong. So doing these things that seem pointless actually give you a toolbox and an experience that you kind of, what that pain feels like when you got it wrong and you screwed up. Don't be afraid to make those mistakes, because now during your education is a good time to do that. That's a good place to be, because down the line, those things that you learn that felt pointless at the time, or those experiences you got that felt painful at the time, actually turn out to potentially be quite valuable. There were things, I was never a great public speaker, that annoyed me, but just doing it, even though I hated it, was actually kind of helpful. Learning things about different areas of mathematics that just felt like totally meaningless at the time, actually turns out, I went into a phone call where everyone was talking about this area of mathematics, and all of a sudden, actually, I remember learning this. This is kind of helpful, and I had a head start on what I needed to know. And things feel trivial and pointless until such a time later in life that actually it's kind of helpful.
No, that's really, really interesting. So everything's got a purpose and can be useful later on, and that's brilliant. Well, guys, I really, really thank you, Stuart, so much for speaking to us today and talking about your, and also you have been inspirational. I think you've lived up to the blurb at the beginning that I said. You honestly have, because if I knew how to do, I'd come and work for you, because I think what you're doing is so important going forward, and it is something that will really affect the future of human beings without a shadow of a doubt. So thank you so much for doing that, for coming today, and for the students that ask questions, thank you again for doing that. If we've missed any of your questions, or you can think up, or you want to ask more, then I don't think Stuart would be too upset if we've
drop me an email.
If you email them to careers@glasgow.ac.uk, and we'll pass them on to Stuart. And we've had some great big braves in the past, but I really think this has been a fantastic session, and I really want to thank you, Stuart, just for taking time out. And unfortunately, we can't hear everybody clapping, but I think there'd be a huge round of applause for you today. But thanks again for coming. Thanks everybody for being here, all the students that have asked questions, and we'll just wrap up now. So thanks very much. And Simone will come in and give us the housekeeping for the end. So thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.